The US Secretary of State tonight hailed the first step of a long and difficult journey after American and Russian officials sat down together for the first time in years. Today's high-level talks took place in Saudi Arabia. Both sides agreed to appoint teams to begin negotiating a peace deal that would end the war in Ukraine. And the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, claimed Washington had become more understanding of Moscow. But Ukraine was frozen out of the historic meeting, leading President Zelenskyy to demand that decisions must not be taken behind Kyiv's back. Here's our international editor, Emma Murphy.
The handshakes were between the hosts and visitors, not between the visitors themselves. But their presence in the same room was in itself a metaphoric hand of friendship. The United States and Russia, great adversaries and great powers, in conversation once more. As metaphors go, the absence of Ukraine, the future of which in theory this is all about, was perhaps the most telling.
It was positive, upbeat, constructive, everybody there to get to the right outcome.
That didn't seem to worry the Americans, though what the right outcome is for who will worry those who didn't get a place at the table. From the US Secretary of State, until recently derided with the nickname Little Marco by President Trump, a denial that anyone was sidelined.
No one else has been able to bring something together like what we saw today because Donald Trump is the only leader in the world that can. So no one is being sidelined here. But President Trump is in a position that he campaigned on to initiate a process that could bring about an end to this conflict. And from that could emerge some very positive things for the United States, for Europe, for Ukraine, for the world. But first it begins by the end of this conflict.
Rubio and his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov are sanctioned by each other's countries. The Russians see these talks as a way to normalise their relationship.
The conversation was, I think, very useful. We listened and heard each other, and I have reason to believe that the American side has become more understanding of our position.
Both sides will now seek to increase diplomatic and economic cooperation ahead of a possible meeting of Presidents Trump and Putin.
Welcome. Thank you so much.
1,500 miles away, President Zelenskyy was lobbying the Turkish leader, a mutual ally. Talk of economic cooperation with Russia will further alarm the Ukrainians, already worried the future of their country is now potentially part of a great power carve-up.
I am convinced that for Ukraine and for our region, for Europe, it is critical that any negotiations to end the war are not happening behind the backs of the key parties affected by the Russian aggression.
After 3 years of war, the president and his nation may now be at one of the greatest moments of peril. Emma Murphy, ITV News.
Well, here the Defence Secretary said today that any peacekeeping force in Ukraine would require US involvement. Our political correspondent Carl Dinnen is at the Ministry of Defence. Carl, John Healey warned, didn't he, that decisions made in the coming weeks will define global security for a generation.
Yes, Mary, because those weeks could determine the extent to which the United States is still prepared to guarantee the security of Europe. Certainly the government view here, and what John Healey was saying earlier, is that to keep the US engaged, then Europe, and that includes Britain, is going to have to be prepared to do more to militarily guarantee any peace deal in Ukraine.
The European countries have to play a leading part in that guarantee, but require a backstop from the US, because in the end it is only the US that can provide the deterrence to Putin that will prevent him attacking again.
Now, what a US backstop means in practical terms remains to be seen, but it is the view of sources here at the Ministry of Defence that in order to get the US to commit to such a thing, then Europe is going to have to come together and create some sort of united offer in terms of what it will do in Ukraine and take that to Washington. The problem is, of course, that we've seen over the last 24 hours or so that Europe is entirely disunited about whether or not to start even thinking about offering peacekeepers. One thing, though, is clear, Mary, and that is that Britain is going to have to start spending more on defence, and that almost inevitably means spending less on other priorities.
OK, Carl Dinnen at the Ministry of Defence, thank you. OK, well, let's return to Emma, who is with me in the studio. The US and Russia seem to be getting on pretty well today, which will have cast a bit of a shadow over Europe, I guess.
Yeah, over Europe and also, without question, over Ukraine. I mean, just think back to how many times over the last 3 years we've heard politicians and world leaders talk about Putin's illegal war, Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine, how Putin and Russia will pay, how the sanctions will destroy their economy. That today has been held up as completely shallow, because what we saw around that table was the United States and Russia, and basically a victory for Russia. Everything that Volodymyr Zelenskyy has said about, he does not want to see Russia's invasion go unpunished, Russia's killing go unpunished, and Russia's territorial gains go unpunished. Well, that's basically what it seems to be turning out to be. And you can see why the Ukrainians are so incredibly concerned, and the Europeans. What was striking today was when Marco Rubio did reference the Europeans, it was in relation to sanctions, when he was asked whether or not sanctions would be lifted. And he said, well, that'll have to be a decision for other people, and the Europeans would have to get involved in that. So he's basically not saying the Europeans can come to the table and have a really active voice in this. He's saying they'll have to come along to lift their sanctions as and when we do. So, yeah, a big shadow cast for Europe and also for Ukraine at this point.
Now, today was very much a preliminary. The Americans said, the start of a long, difficult path and whatever. But and it was just envoys, wasn't it? Do we have any idea of when Trump and Putin might meet?
Well, that is the big question. They wouldn't go to say that they were going to set a date at this point, but there's no question it will happen. I think it will probably happen quite soon. If you think about it, it's meant to be happening in Saudi again. You've got Ramadan starting in about 10 days' time, so that's going to affect it. So I think you could potentially see a meeting pretty soon. And then, of course, Zelenskyy will go on March the 10th. So he will want to go probably when something has happened, so he can be briefed, which is a pretty desperate state for him to be in, to have to go and find out what's been decided about his country.
Emma Murphy, thank you. It's expected today's talks will pave the way for a meeting between US President Donald Trump and the Russian President Vladimir Putin. James Nixie, who's director of the Russia and Eurasia programme at Chatham House, told ITV News if Ukraine is sacrificed, there'll be other European nations in Putin's sights.
Volodymyr Zelenskyy has already said that he will not accept any deal that is reached over above his head, the head of the Ukrainians. And it's very hard to see how they can have any confidence. That is to say, the Russians and the Americans can have any confidence that anything that they agree will be abided by the Ukrainians. They understand the Ukrainians reasonably well. They know what they want. And they understand that Ukraine needs to be sovereign and whole and continues to be and retain its army and its government. And that is the exact opposite of what Vladimir Putin wants. The only thing I would add to that is that it is important to note at this point that America is not in this negotiation as a Ukrainian ally. It's there as a mediator, and that's an important difference here. We see a situation whereby the Americans they have a perfectly reasonable point that the Europeans should be responsible for their own defense. It's more the fact that they don't seem to care in the same way that they once upon a time did about the fate of the Eastern European countries. So this idea that we will be with Ukraine as long as it takes, imperfect sentence though that was, that's simply not there anymore. So America is not so much, it's barely even neutral. It's more interested in being one of a concert of great powers, along with China and Russia, to carve up the world, something very 19th century carve up. This does strike of appeasement and accommodationism, whereby Russia's desires and ambitions must be accommodated to make the problem go away. The only problem with that is, of course, it won't make the problem go away. Even if you were willing to sacrifice Ukraine, and you shouldn't, of course, but even if you were, then obviously there would be others next on Vladimir Putin's hit list. Moldova is probably a next target, followed by the Baltic states. Ultimately, we are looking at a recreation of empire, and it broadly conforms to the boundaries which constituted the Soviet Union, which broke up in 1991, of course.